Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026. Hello. We are joined today, I'm super excited to say, by Jaxon Tolbert.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So you are a part of the Huntsville Environmental Coalition.
That's right.
And a very recent grad of UAH.
Yeah, May 2023.
Amazing. So I found out about you from the HSV Progressive podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out that podcast. And saw that you were working on environmental justice.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't know that HEC existed, so I'm super excited to get involved in that. And I just wanted to kind of talk to you about how I feel like a lot of times people associate environmentalism with like degrowth and so they see environmentalism as antithetical to economic growth.
Right.
And what I liked about some of the things you said is that, you can feed two birds with one stone here.
Mm-hmm.
You can absolutely have economic growth and environmental protection, which is very interesting to me. I kind of wanted to talk to you about your capstone project. Haven't seen a lot of people around here talking about environmental justice, and then talk about how the issue of economic growth and environmentalism meet perfectly on the topic of housing.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, tell us about your capstone project.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
what is a capstone project?
Yeah, so UAH, the Honors College, has a program where a student can create a capstone project. So basically any sort of project or thesis of their choice that's rooted in their degree. And there's all sorts of those projects out there, many science-focused and engineering-focused projects, but really no EJ-focused projects, not a lot on urban planning or urban policy. So I wanted to use this project to address a knowledge gap that exists in Huntsville. My project sponsor was Dr. Zhao. She's in the UAH Political Science Department, and she's done work with the U.S. Green Building Council previously. And she's also done some EJ work in the Black Belt of Alabama. So I wanted to team up with her for this project. But essentially, one of the main issues is that Huntsville, the state of Alabama especially, but Huntsville as a city lacks a definition of environmental justice. And so what we did was look at a lot of the past literature around the formal practice of environmental justice, looking at creating a definition and then also creating a methodology for identifying these communities in Huntsville when you look at a map. So what neighborhoods are these places in?
When you say these places, what does that mean?
Yeah. So the format that we used was a census tract. So a census tract is essentially just a really small breakdown of a neighborhood. It's usually a couple blocks that the Census Bureau uses to collect demographic information, and it's often used and tied to federal funding opportunities.
So are you looking for disadvantaged census tracts?
Yeah. So I guess let's just jump into it. We used 3 determinations to create our methodology for what defines an EJ community. So there are 3 things: income, race, and environmental indicators.
So just on a philosophical level, an EJ community would be a community that is environmental injustices are done to right now or have been in the past, or what defines an environmental justice community? Yeah,
well, to define that, let's start with the definition of environmental justice.
Sounds good.
So this is what I started with when looking at this project. So the EPA definition is: environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that's one definition, but there is no universal federal term for an environmental justice community. The EPA uses overburdened community. Other departments use underserved and disadvantaged. So we found that there was no universal federal term, and even looking at the state offices for how they define EJ communities, there's no one definition. But regardless, you look at higher environmental burden, a large concentration of Black and brown people, and then also low income. So those were the three qualifications that we used for this project, and happy to get into that a little.
So these are
too.
Communities with demographics that would indicate that they've generally been left out of the process.
That's right.
Okay, great.
Yeah, the political process as well.
That's what I mean. Yeah, I mean, these decisions are unfortunately made politically. So
absolutely,
if you're deciding where to put a polluting factory or a wastewater treatment plant or a highway, right? These are, we know, empirically speaking, these have been disproportionately placed near majority minority neighborhoods. Yeah. And these decisions are not made with the input of the residents of those neighborhoods.
Right, right.
Okay, so that's an environmental justice community.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So happy to get into how we kind of defined this in the project itself. So I mentioned those three qualifiers: race, income, and environmental indicators. So for income, we used the qualification of at least a 20% poverty rate, or the median family income has to be less than 80% of the state or metro family income. So that's a U.S. Treasury definition. And then for race, the tract population of color has to be greater than or equal to 70%. So that's highly segregated, because the citywide is about 35%. And we base this off of a definition from the Maryland Office of Environmental Justice. And then for environmental risks, are you guys familiar with a mapping tool from the EPA called EJ Screen?
No.
Okay. Well, it's a pretty cool open source tool where you can look at census tracts from any city, any county across the country, look at different levels of pollution like PM like 2.5 and looking at water pollution and rank that based on the census tract. But for our tracts to qualify as EJ, they had to have at least one environmental indicator with an EJ index greater than or equal to the 80th percentile. So we use the EJ Screen map for that. So for the total, in order for these tracts to classify as environmental justice, they had to meet at least two of those three indicators: race, income, or environmental hazards.
And did you do any research on whether the amount of environmental pollution was greater in the census tracts that had a greater percentage of non-white residents?
Yes, and they are. It turns
Shocker.
out. Yeah, I know. Mm-hmm.
You don't say.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know how much overlap there is, but that's like, I used to live in Chattanooga, and all the Superfund, or places that qualified as Superfund sites, were generally the lower income neighborhoods throughout lower Chattanooga.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that you could see the correlation just driving around.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And the Redstone Arsenal is actually qualified as a Superfund site on the EJ Screen map. So there's a fact for you.
Fun fact.
Yeah. Huh.
Okay, so what else did you find?
Yeah, so we found that 23 Huntsville census tracts identified as EJ communities.
23 out of how many?
Out of around 100, it depends on how far you go and how you determine your definition, but 23.
About a quarter.
About a quarter. Yeah, the estimated total population is around 75,812 people as of the 2020 census. So that's around a third of Huntsville's population, which is crazy. So the median family age was 33 years. The poverty rate was 27.6%. The average racial composition: 24.5% white, 60% black, 1.4% Asian, 10.3% Hispanic, and 2.8% two or more races. So a higher concentration of black and brown, especially black people. And yeah, so that's in terms of developing and creating a definition for these communities. But something else that we also ranked was sustainability performance indicators. And I guess I want to get into a little bit the city development that was informing that was informing this project in the first place. So I know you guys are from Huntsville, but are still kind of new to the environmental space.
Yes.
Are you guys familiar with the Green 13 report?
No.
From 2010? Okay. So this is a report that Huntsville City did with the backing of Mayor Battle back in 2010. It was authored with a $40,000 grant from the Department of Energy. And it was essentially a sustainability report with different sections on how Huntsville can become more sustainable. So that report was done in 2010, and it sat on the shelf. So Huntsville Environmental Coalition was formed out of this lack of movement around sustainability as a formalized office or staff position in the city. So I've been involved with HEC since around the beginning of 2022. And before that, there were a couple key people from our group who visited the mayor's office and said, Mr. Mayor, there is this Green 13 report that has just been sitting, and we are falling behind in terms of competition from sustainability offices from other sister cities like Chattanooga, Nashville, even Little Rock. And so they made that economic argument behind why Huntsville needs to create a sustainability office, have some sort of formalized city entity to handle this stuff, rather than just Operation Green Team. And the mayor was very receptive to that. And so what he did was create something called the Huntsville Environmental Sustainability Committee. I know there's a lot of acronyms, but this is a mayor-appointed group of different experts and mainly economic development officials that were going to revive this report. And it was revived, and it was released in April 2023, right around the time that I finished this project. But in order to develop the environmental priorities, that committee did a online survey and an in-person survey at Campus 805, kind of a gentrifying area. And they looked at citizens' priorities in terms of energy, housing, built environment, infrastructure, and food security. And they got almost no response from North Huntsville, from West Huntsville. A&M, I think they got 2 responses from the district where Alabama A&M University HBCU is. And so that was really concerning to me, but also us as a group. So we wanted to do this project, me and Dr. Zhao, to basically say like, hey, where are these communities at? What is happening in them in terms of energy burden, in terms of transportation, in terms of housing? And then also, does the city even know where these places are? So that's really what catalyzed this project. Thankfully, that report that was completed in April has, it did include a definition of environmental justice, but it did not include a definition of an environmental justice community or where those are, or a map of where those are in Huntsville. So yeah, like, were you guys aware of this process?
I knew negative amounts about any of this before I listened to your interview on the HSC Progressive podcast. To be fair, I've only been paying attention to local politics for the past 3 months.
Yeah.
So I moved back almost 3 years ago. Just wild to me.
Yeah.
But I've just gotten involved really locally.
Yeah.
I think this is super interesting. I think this relates to one of my hobby horses, which is a lot of people want to talk about community input and deliberative democracy and direct democracy. And I understand how those things sound good, and they can be good. But one thing that we need to be aware of when we talk about these things is that what ends up happening is that the people with the most resources have the biggest voices,
right,
because they have the time and the energy and the, stakes often to show up, to have their voices heard, to come to the meetings, to respond to the surveys. It takes a lot of time and energy, and people who are marginalized, that's what they don't have a lot of extra, is time and energy and money and resources. And so if we're going to have community input and we don't put resources into making it representative, it won't be.
Right.
And it's almost worse to have community input that's not representative because it ends up being a wealth transfer.
Yeah.
Upwards.
Yeah, you end up basically pushing out any input from anyone who's not rich, essentially.
You're excluding.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what are wealthy people who are involved going to do? They're going to advocate for themselves.
They're going to develop policy that makes things even worse for the marginalized communities.
Correct. So that's just a thing that I feel like isn't intuitive, or isn't obvious, but when you read the studies and you show up to the meetings, it's like, oh yeah, this is how it works.
Right.
So I think it's good to bring light to that issue.
Yeah.
I think this is great. Did you have any questions? I'm gonna read my notes really quickly too, because I read the capstone report and I had some thoughts. I believe.
Sure.
Not that I can immediately think of.
Sure.
We can cut this part out. Great thing about having anyway. But yeah, no, it's really, I didn't know that I've heard of Operation Green Team before, but I didn't know that there was a larger push to really dive into the data. It's definitely problematic that they did a lot of the interview or the surveying at Campus 805, because that's definitely not a representational segment of you get a couple of segments of Huntsville's population, but only a couple. That there's not. Yeah.
Okay, I did have a specific question.
Sure.
On page 52, it says 82% of Huntsville commuters drive alone to work, while 1% walks, and the number who bicycle or ride transit is too low to express as a percentage. Yeah. How are the remaining 17% getting to work?
I'm not sure. That data is from the American Community Survey from, I believe, 2021. And all of that data can be accessed through their map. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to take a closer look at that page.
Okay, no worries. Yeah. So going back to housing, since this is housing for Huntsvillians. So I'm going to just read the definition of environmental justice from the EPA again. The fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of, et cetera, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So what occurred to me is that exclusionary zoning and discretionary review amounts to unfair treatment on the basis of race, color, national origin, and income. And you could argue that exclusionary zoning isn't environmental legislation, regulation, or policy, but I think it is, in that it directly impacts the environment.
Right.
So I'm sure you're both familiar with what exclusionary zoning is. So it's, for the listeners, zoning that prohibits certain kinds of housing, usually denser, more affordable housing. So things like lot size minimums, parking minimums, height maximums, prohibitions on multifamily housing. That's exclusionary zoning. It's called exclusionary because it's meant to exclude that kind of housing, but really it's meant to exclude the kind of person who lives in that kind of housing, who tends to be browner and poorer than the people who live in large single-family homes with big lots and low density. So, I just think that, like I said, getting rid of exclusionary zoning, so legalizing dense affordable housing throughout the city. So 15% of the city is zoned in such a way that you're even legally allowed to build dense affordable housing?
15 is explicitly zoned. There's a gray area for about 5% additional. So up to 20, probably somewhere between 15 to 20.
Yeah. The permitting process is discretionary as opposed to by right, which means, again, this is a process that favors the less marginalized because they have the time and energy and resources to get in and say, no, we don't want dense affordable housing in our neighborhood.
Right.
So yeah, I just kind of wanted to talk through how, when it comes to environmental justice, so environmental being, these cats are so loud.
I knew it was going to happen. I knew it.
Environmental being like, how do we pollute less? And justice being, how do we include more, represent more equally, decrease the discrimination in the way that we treat people based on race and income, for example, national origin, et cetera. Zoning is really that where those things intersect.
Yeah.
Because zoning not only creates, exclusionary zoning not only creates more pollution, right? So you've got longer commutes when people live more in a sprawled situation. You've got the cost to heat and cool a single family home. You've got the cost so that's energy consumption. That's, pollution created by heating and cooling. There's the fact that people who live densely don't have to drive necessarily. They can walk and take transit and bike much more easily. Yeah. So there's public health impacts as well. There's the pollution created by maintaining lawns. Individual lawns create a lot more pollution and use up a lot more water than, a shared public park, for example. I don't know. There's just a lot of ways in which building densely is much better for the environment. And it's just from a pure conservation standpoint, right? Let's say you've got, undeveloped land. And we do have a lot of beautiful undeveloped land in Huntsville, Alabama. Well, if you want to house, 50,000 more people, which we probably will have to do over the next few decades, you can develop a lot less land if you build densely on the land that you're developing.
Absolutely.
People look at a high rise and they think, I don't know, bad for the environment or unnatural, but it's like, what's bad for the environment is a subdivision. What's unnatural is sprawl, where you're taking undeveloped land, developing it, putting subdivisions on it, pouring fertilizer and pesticides on these, lawns. So yeah, I just feel like there's a disconnect between reality and aesthetics often when it comes to the environmental movement. And it's like, we're not going to avoid bringing new people into Huntsville as long as we keep creating jobs. People are going to show up. The question is, are we going to keep the people who live here, or are we going to displace them out into the suburbs? Which is not only a justice issue, but is an environmental issue. Because if they're still working in the city, then they're driving these long commutes, and that's what we've seen in California. Right? Hour and a half long commutes for people who've been displaced out into the hinterlands because they can't afford housing in the city anymore because they didn't build homes for them. So anyway, just curious about, I didn't see recommendations for rezoning in the capstone project, but how do you feel about that as an environmental justice solution?
Yeah. Well, I'll say I'm not a zoning or housing expert for sure, but I am an advocate for more dense housing in cities and then also making those buildings more energy efficient so that people are not burdened with their energy bill. In terms of multifamily units, we did calculate an average for multifamily versus citywide. So in all of the EJ tracts, there was an average of 40.9% multifamily units compared to the citywide rate, which is about 29%. So you have a higher concentration of that there. We also kept an eye out for housing and urban development assisted properties. And we found, which is connected to Huntsville Housing Authority. They get funding from that. And we found 4 HUD assisted, Huntsville Housing assisted properties in 3 EJ tracts. The Northwoods Housing Development in Tract 12, Johnson Tower in Brookside, and Butler Terrace in Tract 21, and then Lincoln Park in Track 30. Are you guys familiar with the Mill Creek redevelopment plan?
No.
Okay.
I've heard it mentioned, but I don't know.
You've heard it mentioned. Okay. I have been learning about this myself, and the most recent article that came out about it was right when I published this project. And this is a $400 million redevelopment plan. The full title is the Choice Neighborhood Initiative. And there's not a lot of conversation around it. Apparently, it's a HUD-sponsored program to redevelop these 4 properties that I just mentioned that we listed in this project. They want to maintain affordable housing and income diversity and increase density to achieve a, quote, majority market rate community. Do you have any thoughts on, or are you familiar with the term majority market rate community?
I know what market rate means, but I don't know what... I'm assuming this is like I don't know. It sounds like an inclusionary zoning thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it seems like. But the master plan is 133 pages. So it's a lot to go through. But happy to send it to you guys. But what I realized is that through that article that was published in April on this is that Johnson Tower and Butler Terrace were already demolished by the time I had finished this capstone project. And they also had to evacuate people because of radon poisoning. So a lot of these buildings were just in terrible, terrible condition. And so something that I think about when I think about how this project can apply to housing is that one of the recommendations we made was that the city needs to become familiar with both state and federal funding opportunities to improve many areas of sustainability, but especially housing. Are you guys familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act?
I mean, somewhat.
Somewhat? Yeah? Okay. Awesome. Well, there is this one program in it called the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, and it's up to $4.8 billion in HUD loans, which HUD is connected to Huntsville Housing Authority, up to $750,000 per building and $40,000 per unit for indoor air quality renovations, improving energy and water efficiency, building electrification, and climate resilience. So really making these buildings LEED certified or another certification. And of course, that Inflation Reduction Act was passed federally in the summer of 2022. But what we found is that not a lot of people, actually nobody in the city has talked about this or the funding opportunities available for that. So moving forward, I'm really curious to see what is the capacity of the grants office for grant writing for things like this. And then also, of course, one of the main recommendations from this report was that Huntsville needs to hire a sustainability officer and ideally a sustainability educator alongside. That's how Little Rock, Arkansas does it, to serve as the point contact for these types of projects in the city, so that it's not just the students or the volunteers having to do this whenever they have free time.
So is the retrofitting, is that just for public housing or is it for private housing as well?
No, that's just for public housing for owners of multifamily units, but the Inflation Reduction Act does have a bunch of home energy efficiency credits and then also some loan programs that people can take advantage of for door upgrades, weatherization, heat pumps, electric heat pumps, that kind of stuff.
I mean, how many publicly owned housing units do we have in Huntsville?
Well, we have 4 in our EJ
4
communities.
Buildings.
4 complexes. Yeah.
4 complexes. Mm-hmm. Do you know how many units?
I don't know how many units.
All right. Yeah. I mean, sure, we should retrofit our 4 complexes, but I think what is interesting about the subsidized housing conversation is that we need a lot more subsidized housing. At the same time, we can't afford to build enough subsidized housing if we don't have enough market rate housing to keep the costs at a reasonable level.
Right.
So in San Francisco, it costs $800,000 to build 1 unit of affordable housing because the land is so expensive because the permitting process is so expensive, and labor and materials, of course. But I think that building more market rate housing by streamlining the permitting process and legalizing dense affordable housing throughout the city makes it more affordable to build the subsidized housing that we need, because there are problems with subsidized housing, right? Like you said, they're often, and this is the biggest problem, at least in the United States, probably elsewhere, I'm too ignorant to say, but it's comparatively easy to get grants to build it. It's very difficult to get funding to maintain it. And the people who are capable of being good stewards of affordable housing can also be stewards of market rate housing and earn a lot more money and have a lot less rigmarole to deal with and have, an easier clientele. And so they're going to do that. And so, nobody wants to be a subsidized housing landlord. So that's a huge problem, and that's probably always going to be a problem. And so not only would providing subsidized housing be cheaper if we built more market rate housing, but we would need less of it, because if we had cheaper rent, fewer people would need subsidies for their housing. And I honestly think it's a lot more efficient to create abundant, dense, affordable housing throughout the city and then give the people who still can't afford it cash versus try to be, housing developers. Like, bureaucrats are not necessarily good housing developers. Leave that to the experts. Anyway.
Can I ask a question based off of that? Yeah, bureaucrats are not housing experts. They're not. We found that they're not sustainability experts out there.
No.
So, obviously, kind of a universal pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, one of the things is that we need to hire somebody who can focus at least on the sustainability aspects. What about for housing? I mean, do you guys think that maybe we should have some sort of office that is located maybe in the mayor's office or in a department that focuses on just affordable housing and building these new complexes, and maybe can work alongside a hypothetical sustainability officer?
That's a good question. All else equal, I would prefer not to do that, because I mean, it costs taxpayer money to create this, job. And it's like, at the end of the day, we're looking at less regulation. We're looking at less bureaucracy. We're looking at less red tape. So creating if the most efficient way to legalize dense affordable housing throughout Huntsville and streamline the permitting process is to hire someone who can go in and, streamline the building code and update it and, submit a zoning proposal that actually gets through and, look at the permitting process and take out the parts that are unnecessary. If that's the most efficient way to do that, wonderful. Love it. But if it's not, then rather not have that salary, rather not have that position.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, whatever gets it done is what I'm for. But at the end of the day, we need Huntsville doing less on housing.
Interesting. Okay.
Because there are people called developers whose whole job is to build housing as cheaply as possible.
Yeah.
That's what they do. So, Huntsville's involvement thus far has just made the process more expensive, less fair, worse for the environment. So let's get that out of the way.
Yeah. Is it more of a responsibility in terms of the developers? Like, are the developers lacking, or do they need to have some sort of enforcement mechanism if the city's not being involved?
Enforcement for what?
For building more housing or ensuring that it's,
it's the profit motive, baby. Okay. They're incentivized to do it. That's their whole job, right? They're going to build housing as profitably as possible.
Right.
And absent government regulation, the most profitable housing to build, the problem with luxury housing is that luxury housing isn't really better than non-luxury housing. The finish is, it's the land.
Yeah.
Why is the land expensive? Regulation, process. It's the permitting process, it's the zoning. So if we get that out of the way, luxury housing starts being actual luxury housing, and the default starts being, what's the housing we can get the most people in the most quickly, and that's cheaper housing.
Right.
So we don't really need anyone at City Hall making developers do their jobs. We need people at City Hall getting out of developers' way so they can do their jobs.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, I didn't even really think about that, but that's a great perspective. Yeah. Are there any examples of other cities that you've seen where this has been done successfully?
Absolutely. Seattle built a lot of dense housing, and their average rents decreased.
Wow.
Yes. And in Navy Yard, so they actually did a study in the Washington, D.C. area. They compared Navy Yard and, it wasn't Arlington. It was Georgetown. I forget, a different neighborhood. Okay. And in Navy Yard, they built a lot of new apartments. And in the, control neighborhood, they did not. And I don't remember if rents actually decreased or they just increased at a slower rate in Navy Yard versus the control neighborhood in DC. Okay. In Minneapolis, I want to say, there was actually just an article like last week that showed that they, I don't know, people say like they eliminated single family zoning, and when you get into the details, but anyway, they did rezone in such a way as to make it legal to build more dense affordable housing, and they had the lowest rate of inflation in the nation.
Wow.
Yes, because housing is so much a part of every family's expenditure that when you reduce the cost of housing, you meaningfully reduce overall inflation.
Wow.
So yes, there are examples. Building more housing does in fact reduce the average cost of housing, and again reduces racial inequality, reduces income inequality, reduces racial and income segregation, increases access to education, reduces commute times, improves public health, improves economic growth, increases geographic mobility, increases economic mobility, so many positive impacts of just two pretty simple moves.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think the concept of the city getting out of the way for the developers is probably going to be a new idea for a lot of the people in my environmental circle. Could you talk a little bit more about what is the biggest way that the city currently is getting in the way of developers? What does that look like on the ground?
That's an excellent question.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
It's on my list to find out. I don't know. Okay. I know that only 15% of the city is even zoned for multifamily. Okay. So it's simply illegal to build multifamily on the vast majority.
I think R2 is multifamily, R1 is single, and is an overwhelming majority of housing zones in Huntsville.
Okay. Wow.
But that's true in San Francisco as well. But in San Francisco, so there's this guy named Brian Goggin at the Turner Center for Housing at Berkeley, and he actually did a study of how long and how expensive the permitting process is in San Francisco, and found that it's actually the permitting process that is the main blocker to housing in dense affordable housing in San Francisco. So, it was an average of 3 to 7 years. I think the worst was 10 years to get a permit. And you have to buy the land and make your mortgage payments while you fight the permitting process. So these developers are spending years paying for land they can't develop and may never get to.
Right.
So every dollar that they're spending sitting on that land paying the mortgage goes into the price of those units later.
Wow.
There are literally there's a job called permit expediter in San Francisco. Developers have to pay they don't have to, but they are incentivized to pay permit expediters. And Muhammad Nuru was a bureaucrat in San Francisco associated with permitting, and he is in prison right now for corruption.
Oh my gosh.
There was all kinds of corruption, of course there is, in this expensive Byzantine permitting process.
Right.
So I don't know what Huntsville's permitting process looks like. I've asked. I have not gotten a straight answer. I know that it's discretionary, and I know that on average, discretionary is longer and less fair than by right. So by right means if my project meets the zoning and building code regulations, I get a permit, which is the way to do it. There's no excuse to do it any other way.
Right.
But some cities, including Huntsville, have a discretionary review process, which means, as far as I can tell, anyone for any reason can delay or block you getting a permit for your multifamily housing development, even though it meets all requirements.
Yeah. If someone were to change that discretionary review process, would it be the city planner, the mayor?
These are excellent questions. This
Well,
is exactly
okay.
what I need to know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think everyone is on this journey together. Wow.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's see. How much time do we have left?
We have 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay. One thing that we've encountered a lot in our environmental sustainability endeavors is NIMBYism.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about NIMBYism and its effects on building more housing?
Yeah, NIMBYs are kind of why we have trouble doing it.
Yeah.
So NIMBYs are why we have exclusionary zoning in the first place.
And just I'm sure everyone listening to this knows what a NIMBY is, but can you
Thank you.
explain?
Thank you.
Acronyms.
Yeah.
So NIMBY stands for not in my backyard, which means, yeah, we need dense affordable housing, but not in my backyard. Or we need a new homeless shelter, but not in my backyard. Or
It sounds nice, just as long as it doesn't affect me.
Exactly. We need a sewage treatment plant, but not in my backyard, yada, yada. So, yeah, I think the main problem with the discretionary review process is that if everyone loved dense affordable housing in their backyard, a discretionary review process wouldn't matter because nobody would stand up and say, we don't want this. But because a lot of people don't want to live near the kind of people who live in dense affordable housing, they use the discretionary review process to discourage dense affordable housing in their neighborhoods, which means it's a mechanism by which we've codified segregation and inequality.
Right.
Because the people with the most resources have the most ability to deploy those resources to keep people with the least resources away from them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a mechanism by which we use state violence to create more inequality and more racial and economic segregation. And discretionary review is the mechanism by which the haves steal from the have-nots. Because every extra dollar I spend on housing, because developers can't build dense affordable housing where it would be profitable for them to do so, benefits the people who don't have to live near those kind of people. And their kids get to go to the good schools, and they get to have the nice parks, and they have the high housing values, and all that housing equity goes to them, while people like us pay higher and higher rents and get displaced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, are there any low-hanging fruits that you think, I don't want to say like the city, because it seems like it could be the city removing itself. Are there any other low-hanging fruits besides that discretionary review process that the city should be removing itself from to open up these pathways?
I think the only other thing would be the building code.
Okay, yeah.
So one of the things our goal, Housing for Huntsvillians, is to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026. And there is no way to sustainably, cost-effectively eliminate homelessness without legalizing what's called the lowest rungs of the housing ladder, which means there needs to be something between a tent and a code compliant home right now.
Okay.
Right? So things like SROs, single room occupancy. So these are kind of like hotel rooms, but meant for long-term stays where maybe you share a bathroom or you share a kitchen. It would be like a floor of homes, but, certain amenities are shared. This is a very cost-effective way to get people into, perfectly adequate housing.
Yeah.
But our building code, if I'm not wrong, makes this kind of housing illegal to build. And so things that are either outdated or not actually aimed at health and safety, but are aimed at aesthetics, people don't. The reason SROs are illegal in most cities is not because there's anything inherently wrong with them. It's because people don't want to live next to them. And so would you rather live next to an SRO or a tent?
Right. That is the question.
So we need to legalize housing that maybe you wouldn't want to live in, but is a huge step up from what hundreds of people are living in right now in Huntsville.
Yeah,
so I would say the building code would be a huge opportunity to unlock economic growth, reduce inequality, get people into homes and save money. Homelessness is so expensive, and building SROs is free to the city. It's not just free, it makes the city money.
Yeah.
But you have to get past the NIMBYs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love all of these new acronyms and things that I'm learning, and I think it would be beneficial I will spread this to my circles as well. I'm glad that we're talking about this. So I'll say on the sustainability side, for those who are interested, because of this report, the mayor is creating a sustainability commission with a couple of folks the city council has to vote on it, but the mayor has recommended folks to be on there, including a couple people from our coalition, which is good.
From HEC. Wonderful.
Yep. And so that vote will be in September, and we think it'll go through. But
so the mayor has appointed people to be on the commission.
Yes,
on
recommended.
The HESC, Huntsville Environmental Sustainability Coalition.
I think that there was the committee that was just to make the report.
Okay.
But I think it will just be called the Huntsville Sustainability Commission.
And
that'll probably have its own website.
Okay.
At some point.
Right. And so he's recommended people to be on the commission.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And 2 people are on the list from HEC.
That's right.
Okay. And then people can vote in September.
Yeah, the city council will vote.
And who are the HEC members that people should vote for?
So I need to look at the email because I've only seen screenshots.
Okay.
Because this is a pretty new development. But one of them is Ankur Shah, who is a climate geospatial data scientist and also a UAH alum, and he's awesome and talks about regenerative economies, and he's great. So hopefully the city will vote him through. But so we're making some progress on that front. And I think that the intersections of energy and housing can be, listened to and by the commission, and that will be a great space to go and talk about those issues. But in terms of everything else that we've talked about today, I mean, what are next steps that we as citizens can do to help create space for these conversations? Can we be advocates in any way, pushing policy forward? Should we contact our local council members, or should we say, hey, you should keep your hands off of this?
No, I think at some point I intend to get together some model legislation. And so I would love community support if and when that happens, and community support getting it together,
Yeah.
What kind of legislation, do you want? And so if people could sign up for our email newsletter, that would be awesome, because then I can, we can be in contact about the legislation. And then, once we have it together, we can ask you via email, like, hey, can you get in touch with the relevant people, relevant stakeholders? I think the huge thing that we can all do right now is when a project is in the debate phase, which again should not exist, but because it does, advocate for it. Like, this is not about whether you want apartments at this place at this time. Maybe you don't for whatever reason. Maybe you think they're ugly. Maybe you don't want the traffic, yada, yada. But I want people to understand that every apartment that gets built adds to an environment where more people can afford to live. And not just more people, but the kind of people we need to be protecting as people with resources.
Right.
And so if you don't like this development, okay, like, let's legalize the kind of development you would want.
Right.
But blocking this development just exacerbates the environmental, economic injustice, all those problems that we're already seeing. And so anytime that there's a new development, there will be people, especially people who have resources who live nearby, who will show up and write and say, we don't want this. And the problem is it's very concentrated benefit to them to block the housing, but very diffuse costs to block the housing. But if we can all get educated and we can get empathetic, then we can show up and say, maybe this only cost me a few more dollars in rent each month to block it, but I see the big picture and I see the justice angle of this.
Right.
And so I want this new housing here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great. And we're happy to support that in any way we can.
Thank you.
We're making a website. So if a project like that does happen, we'll be happy to put that on our website. hsvec.org should launch in the middle of September. And of course we have monthly meetings. So always welcoming new voices and, new educational opportunities. So this is awesome. And I'm so glad you guys are doing this podcast. I listened to your intro on the way over here again, just to kind of get in the mood. And I think that this is the right time. I think it's going to connect with a lot of people, and it's very important. So thank you guys for putting this together.
I am so excited to have made your acquaintance and to be connected. Absolutely. And for us both to be like ramping up at the same time in a lot of ways is super exciting. And yeah, definitely. So check out that website. Check out your capstone project, which is on your LinkedIn. It's
on my LinkedIn profile. Yep.
Jaxon Tolbert on LinkedIn.
No, we'll link it in the show description and on the web page for this episode as well.
Absolutely.
Sounds great.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no, thank you guys.